Hi guys, we now start the second part of the subtopic called Decolonial, not Post-Colonial. What makes decoloniality more appealing as an option compared to post-colonial critique is that it draws its strength and vitality from the fact that unlike coloniality, it is not bound by one universal definition. This fundamental character of decoloniality is underscored by scholars such as Catherine E. Walsh and Mignolo, who acknowledge that decoloniality is meant to be subjective and contextual, and therefore to provide abstract universals may go against its very grain. Their stated claim and object of interest is relationality, that is, opening up conversations between different local histories and practices of decoloniality so that the politico-epistemic violence of modernity can be contested everywhere. That's a beautiful phrase and term. I'll repeat it once more. Their stated claim and object of interest is relationality, that is, opening up conversations between different local histories and practices of decoloniality so that the politico-epistemic violence of modernity can be contested everywhere. Their emphasis on relationality is precisely to drive home the point that there is no way to do and conceive decoloniality, which also means that each society has there is no one way to do and conceive decoloniality. Every place will have its own ways to decolonialize and decolonize. Decolonization is done, decolonialize. Which also means that each society has the right to define what constitutes coloniality in its context. Importantly, to ensure that decoloniality is not relegated to the ivory towers of academia, they underscored that decoloniality is a way, quote-unquote, is a way, an option, a standpoint, an analytic, a project, practice, and praxis. It rejects the tendency to compartmentalize theory and praxis and insists that since coloniality is primarily a state of mind, to challenge colonial thought by presenting the decolonial perspective is as much praxis as it is theory. Walsh and Mignolo categorically assert that a decolonial world cannot be, and might I add, must not be built using the conceptual tools of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Other scholars such as Ramon Grosfoguel also subscribe to this position because they believe that the non-West is responding to Eurocentrism with Eurocentric solutions, which explains the rise of European-style nationalism in former colonies instead of responses that are more rooted in their own cultures and civilizations. As opposed to questioning the European expectation and benchmark of civilized nations using indigenous thought, former colonies seem more eager to join the club of civilized nation-states to prove that they are not savages anymore. That this generates a form of internal coloniality that strengthens the European worldview, especially in the political realm, is lost sight of. The other extreme of the non-West's response is to reject the validity of everything that has emanated from Europe without realizing that some of the so-called European contributions may in fact be products of acculturation that the colonizer may have misappropriated from indigenous cultures without attribution. This is a very important point. So obviously, if you don't understand it yet, here Sai Deepak and those decolonial scholars are arguing that some indigenous peoples and colonies and former colonies are embracing Europe-centrism and Eurocentrism so much that even their solutions to their problems is entirely Eurocentric. They are taking refuge in Western-style nationalism, and some societies are rejecting Eurocentrism so much that they end up even rejecting some of the ideas that West appropriated from them and spread it around the world and called it their own, and now the indigenous people are rejecting even those ideas, thinking that they are West's ideas, so we don't want to have anything to do with them, even though they were their ideas in the first place. In light of the above, a middle path has been proposed, which insists on greater dialogue between the West and the non-West, with the clear acknowledgement by the West of the skewed power relations and the coloniality of the system as it exists. The decolonial approach gives the non-West the option of not playing by the rules of the West, especially in the political realm, which allows them to think outside the Westphalian box. In this sense, decoloniality is a form of measured epistemic disobedience, which is not limited in its application to a particular sphere. Such an approach has been described as a move towards a decolonialized transmodern world, which presents two options to indigenous societies. The first allows them to fully reinscribe indigenous OET by reconceptualizing values and institutions, and should that not be possible or feasible, the second envisages formulation of creative alternative definitions based on indigenous ontoepistemologies for so-called European values. Depending on an indigenous society's conviction and taking into consideration the integrated nature of the contemporary world, it may choose between the two. From a practical standpoint, what this means is that a decolonialized indigenous society can choose to completely overhaul its political structure based on its indigenous traditions, or retain the skeletal structure inherited from the colonizer and infuse it with the indigenous spirit by defining the role of the state and the concept of rights and duties based on its native ontoepistem. This also means either doing away with the imported ideological divides of the left, right, and the center, or redefining them based on indigenous intellectual traditions and experience. Interestingly, scholars of decoloniality acknowledge and agree that the Eurocentric colonialities of such ideological divides in every jurisdiction, especially in the non-West, must be confronted. In fact, of pertinence to Bharat is the view of scholars such as Ramon Grosfoguel that the left's underestimation of the coloniality ingrained within contemporary structures is responsible for the second-class treatment of indigenous populations in the non-West, though under ostensibly indigenous governments. Such treatment of indigenous masses in decolonized societies by colonialized native elites in the political and intellectual establishments inherited from the organizer, with the support of international left, has caused significant disillusionment with the international left's so-called commitment to truth and justice. I think this part needs to be read again. Ramon Grosfoguel is saying, left's underestimation of the coloniality ingrained within the contemporary structures is responsible for the second-class treatment of indigenous populations in the non-West. Second-class treatment of indigenous populations in the non-West. So you understand who they are talking about, right? In the case of Bharat, he will be talking about Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and even to some extent Parsis, and of course Sikhs. So imagine me reading the sentence like this, to be more precise. Left's underestimation of the coloniality ingrained within contemporary structures is responsible for the second-class treatment of Hindus, Buddhists, Jains in the non-West. So in Bharat itself, though under ostensibly indigenous governments, the government is indigenous, but the treatment of indigenous people is second class. Such treatment of indigenous masses in decolonized societies by colonialized native elites in the political and intellectual establishments inherited from the colonizer with the support of the international left has caused significant disillusionment with the international left's so-called commitment to truth and justice. So here Grosfoguel is hinting at this might be a reason for so many today's people and indigenous people especially hating the left so much. The other critical aspect that emerges from the decolonial approach is its primary focus on resuscitation of indigenous ontoepistemologies or knowledge, as opposed to being exclusively mired in exclusionary ethnocentrism or race, which has informed colonialism and afflicts post-colonialism as well. In other words, decoloniality cannot be conflated with or accused of defending identity politics the way it is currently understood. Instead, it approaches the question of consciousness and not merely identity, there being a clear distinction between the two. From an OET perspective for two reasons. First, most contemporary national and international or subnational identities are the products of colonial remapping of geographies and creation of identities, and therefore cannot form the basis of decolonial approach. And secondly, a purely ethnocentric approach to culture is characteristic of coloniality, which decoloniality seeks to counter. Simply stated, a North American-style ethnocentric blood quantum-based approach to issues of culture, consciousness, and indigeneity have been largely steered clear of by the decolonial school, since it uses OET of a society as its primary marker. This is in contradistinction to coloniality's embedded Christian-inspired race consciousness, which is projected onto every indigenous movement, whether or not ethnic consciousness is material to it. Therefore, decoloniality's attempts at deracialization of indigeneity, to the extent permitted by indigenous worldviews, preempts labels such as ethno-nationalism and xenophobia, which are often used to undermine the legitimacy of indigenous movements. It is important to clarify that decoloniality does not turn a blind eye to issues of ethnicity, including historic realities, where ethnicity has formed the basis of discrimination by the colonizer. However, its prism of inquiry is largely, if not exclusively, based on the culture is a way of life approach, which recognizes that a culture or a civilization is the product of several influences. Further, decoloniality seeks to rid both culture and civilization of its colonial code, an exercise integral to the freeing of indigenous societies from the burden of having to demonstrate their cultured and civilized status on Western normative benchmarks. One of the reasons ethnicity is perhaps but one of the components of a decolonial approach, as opposed to being the sole component, is the recognition that an exclusively ethnocentric approach can be a slippery slope, given the constant migration or invasion or intermingling of peoples in history. It is for this reason that decoloniality pays more attention to the relationship between an OET framework, which informs consciousness, and a culture or a civilization. The corollary to and consequence of this OET-based approach to consciousness is that it accommodates and is alive to the fact that just as there are colonialized natives who subscribe to the European worldview despite not sharing the race of the colonizer, so are there decolonialized non-natives who are committed to protecting indigenous OETs, despite not sharing the native ethnicity. After all, if coloniality is a state of mind that cuts across ethnicities, so should decoloniality, which too is a state of mind. For example, Dr. Koenraad Elst or David Frawley. At this juncture, it is also important to address another aspect of indigenous societies, namely hereditary social structures which have been burdened with ethnocentrism without basis as a consequence of the colonizer's race-conscious approach to colonized societies. In other words, indigenous societies and their traditional social structures have been unfairly saddled with the West's newfound guilt complex in respect of its race consciousness. In this regard, the decolonial approach should be to understand such structures through the indigenous lens sans colonial biases, and it must be left to each indigenous society to determine the contemporary purchase of such structures based on its OET, without being burdened by the guilt-racked conscience of the West. This would be consistent with decoloniality's commitment to diversity. This point shall be explained better in the context of discussions surrounding caste and tribe in and about Bharat in the next section of the book. The sum and substance of the preceding discussion is that, wherever possible, without doing injustice to indigenous worldviews, a decolonial approach to indigeneity with an intent to preserve indigenous consciousness will be able to better navigate the seemingly uncomfortable yet inescapable realities such as identifying the in-group and out-group to the indigenous worldview. Unfortunately, the very suggestion to identify in and out groups is bound to ruffle quite a few feathers and invite criticisms of parochiality, narrow-mindedness, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that even in the contemporary modern and liberal world, these are the very issues that public discourse, law and policymaking revolve around, especially when questions of heritage, identity and access to resources are involved. Neither modernity nor liberalism has been able to do away with identity politics. If anything, their innate coloniality has pushed such discussions further into the arms of ethnocentrism, particularly in indigenous societies like Bharat. Consequently, since othering is a reality of life that cannot be avoided, it is better to do so on the basis of consciousness as opposed to identity. Accordingly, from a decolonial perspective, it would help to define indigeneity based on the indigeneity on the basis of consciousness instead of identity. Having said this, throughout the discussion undertaken thus far, I have used indigenous or indigeneity to distinguish the colonizer from the colonized. I have also attempted to explain that decoloniality's approach to indigeneity is primarily OET-centric, ontological, epistemological, theological, as opposed to being purely ethnocentric, since ethnocentrism and race consciousness are central to coloniality. In the interest of honesty, conceptual clarity, and consistency, and given the centrality of indigeneity to decoloniality, it is important to unpack the concept of indigeneity in further detail to bring out its assumptions and layers, as we will do in the next video.